Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale.
Yes.
And we're going to be really kind of looking at all the different themes that are present within the book and kind of analyzing them and really thinking about, what Atwood is trying to tell us with this book.
Yeah, and I think what's so fascinating about this work is how it operates on both this micro level, looking at, individual characters, and then that macro level, looking at this dystopian society as a whole.
Yeah.
And how those two levels work together.
Absolutely.
To paint such a chilling but I think really important picture.
Yeah. And it's definitely a story that stays with you long after you finish reading it.
Oh, absolutely.
So I think it's definitely worth a deep dive.
For sure.
So let's start by kind of setting the scene for our listeners who might not be as familiar with the story.
Okay.
So we're in Gilead.
Right.
This is a totalitarian state that has risen out of the ashes of what was once the United States.
Yeah, and it's a theocracy, meaning it's ruled by this very strict interpretation of the Bible.
Right.
And we see how this, religious extremism really permeates every aspect of life in Gilead.
And it's interesting how, we're kind of seeing some of these themes, these ideas play out, in our current society in some ways.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Atwood has said that, everything that happens in this book has happened somewhere at some point in history.
It's a really powerful kind of reminder that, these things aren't just, fictional constructs. They are very much rooted in reality.
And they're things that we need to be aware of and vigilant about.
Yeah, and I think one of the most striking aspects of Gilead is how it so drastically strips away the rights of women.
Absolutely.
Right, women in Gilead are no longer individuals. They have no autonomy.
They're defined solely by their biological function, which is reproduction.
Yeah, they are essentially walking wombs.
Yeah, and they're categorized and controlled based on, this very narrow definition of womanhood.
And I think that's one of the things that makes this story so unsettling, right?
Yeah.
Is that it really kind of hits close to home.
It does.
For a lot of women.
Right.
In terms of, how quickly things can shift and how vulnerable, we can be.
And I think, one of the things that Atwood does so brilliantly is she really dissects the mechanisms of how this oppression takes place.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just this overnight takeover. It's this gradual erosion of rights, this insidious manipulation of language and social norms.
So let's talk about the Handmaids, because I think that's kind of the most iconic image that comes to mind when people think about this book, right?
Yeah.
These women in the red robes.
Right.
So who are the Handmaids and what is their purpose in Gilead?
So the Handmaids are fertile women who have been captured and essentially brainwashed.
Yeah.
They're stripped of their names, their identities, their past lives.
Everything.
And their sole purpose is to bear children for the elite commanders whose wives are unable to conceive.
Yeah, and they're given these names like Offred.
Right.
Right, which literally means of Fred.
Exactly.
Denoting their status as property.
It's a powerful symbol of their dehumanization, right? They are no longer individual.
Right.
They are simply vessels for reproduction.
And I think, the way that their names are taken away is really significant.
That's huge.
Because it's a way of erasing their past.
Right.
Erasing their identity and making them completely subservient to the state.
It's about control.
Yeah.
It's about stripping them of any sense of self.
And I think it's interesting how, even though they are given these new names, Offred still clings to her memories of the past.
She never lets go of who she was.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a powerful act of resistance.
Absolutely.
It's her way of saying, you can control my body, but you can't control my mind.
Yeah, and she has these little acts of rebellion throughout the book.
Yeah.
Whether it's, hoarding a forbidden item
right.
or, engaging in a prohibited relationship. These little things that allow her to maintain some sense of agency and control.
It's her way of clinging to her humanity.
Yeah, and it's interesting how, even in the face of such overwhelming oppression, there's still this spark of hope.
Right.
This will to resist.
And I think that's one of the things that makes this story so compelling. Right? It's not just this bleak dystopian nightmare. It's also a story about resilience and the power of the human spirit.
And I think that's something that we'll see even more of as we continue our deep dive and look at the ways in which, resistance kind of manifests itself
Yes.
in different ways throughout the story.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about how Gilead maintains this control,
Okay.
right? Because it's not just about, physical force.
Yeah.
There's a whole system of psychological manipulation
Yeah.
and social control that's at play.
Yeah. One of the most obvious ways is through language,
Right.
right? Gilead meticulously controls language to shape thought and reinforce its ideology.
And we see this in the terms that they use, right? Like, handmaids unwomen the eyes.
Right.
These labels are designed to dehumanize and to categorize people
Exactly.
and to strip them of their individuality.
And it's interesting, too, how, they take these words that had, positive connotations in the past, like handmaid, a woman who serves,
Right.
but they twist them and distort them to fit their own agenda.
And they also suppress information.
Right.
Oh, absolutely. Any books, historical records, anything that might challenge their ideology is completely banned.
Right.
So it's about controlling the narrative.
Right.
And ensuring that people only have access to the information that Gilead approves.
And this control extends to education as well.
Right.
Women are forbidden from reading or writing. They're
Yeah.
kept ignorant of the world outside Gilead.
It's all about keeping them subservient and dependent.
Exactly.
And I think it's really interesting how Atwood kind of draws these parallels
Yeah.
to historical instances of, totalitarian regimes.
Right.
And how, these tactics have been used time and time again.
It's a reminder that, these things aren't just, fictional constructs.
Yeah.
They are very much rooted in our history.
And I think it's really effective how she doesn't explicitly state these connections,
Right.
but she kind of weaves them in subtly
Right.
so that the reader kind of has to do that work
Yeah.
of making those connections
It
themselves.
makes it all the more impactful.
Yeah, and unsettling.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about the role of religion in Gilead, because it's obviously a theocracy, so religion plays a very central role.
Right.
But it's not just about, faith or spirituality. It's really about how religion is used
Right.
as a tool of control and oppression.
Yeah. They twist and distort scripture to justify their actions.
And they create this facade of divine authority
Right.
to mask what is essentially misogyny and violence.
Yeah, take the ceremony, for example. This monthly ritual that's supposed to be about, procreation and blessing.
Yeah.
But it's essentially state-sanctioned rape.
It's horrifying.
It is.
And it's all done under this guise of piety.
And it's so effective because when people believe that their oppression is God's will,
Right.
it becomes much harder to resist.
It's a really chilling example
It is.
of how easily religion can be weaponized.
Yeah.
And how dangerous that can be.
And we see this throughout history, right?
Absolutely.
Religion has been used to justify all sorts of atrocities.
And it's a reminder that, we have to be critical
right.
of any ideology, whether it's religious or political.
Exactly.
And really examine, the underlying motivations and the consequences of those beliefs.
And I think that's what Atwood is really asking us to do in this novel. To be critical thinkers, to question authority, and to never take anything at face value.
And to really kind of think about, how these systems of power operate.
Yeah.
And how we might be complicit in them.
Absolutely.
Even if we don't realize it.
And that's a really uncomfortable truth.
It is.
But it's one that we need to grapple with.
So let's talk a little bit about how Gilead divides women.
Okay.
Right. Because it's not just about men versus women.
Right.
There's also this really intricate system of female stratification.
Right.
So we have the handmaids.
Yes.
We've talked about them. But we also have the wives.
Right.
The Marthas, the econo-wives, and then the unwomen.
Right. And each of these groups has its own specific role and limitations.
Yeah. And it's interesting how they're all kind of pitted against each other.
Right.
Right. It's a classic divide and conquer strategy.
Exactly.
So let's break down these different groups a little bit.
Okay.
So the wives are obviously the wives of the commanders.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a certain level of privilege.
Yeah.
Right. They live in relative comfort.
They have material wealth.
Yeah.
But they're still very much trapped within the system.
Absolutely.
Right. They're expected to uphold Gilead's values, to be subservient to their husbands.
Yeah, and they often turn a blind eye to the atrocities that are happening around them.
Because they're afraid of losing their status of becoming an unwoman.
Yeah. Yeah. And then we have the Marthas, who are the domestic servants.
You do all the cooking and cleaning.
Yeah, they're kind of like the housekeepers.
Yeah.
And they're always kind of in the background.
Right.
They're not really seen.
They're invisible.
They're invisible.
But they're essential
Yeah.
to the functioning of Gilead.
And then we have the Econo wives,
Right.
who are kind of the lower class wives.
Right.
Their husbands aren't commanders.
Yeah.
And they're expected to kind of do it all.
Right. They are the wife, the mother, the housekeeper, all rolled into one.
Yeah. And they wear these clothes that are made of striped fabric.
Right.
Which is really symbolic.
It's symbolic of their multifaceted role, but also their lower status.
Right.
They're not as valued.
And then we have the unwomen.
Yeah.
And this is kind of the most terrifying category.
Right.
Because it's so broad.
Yeah.
And it encompasses anyone who doesn't fit into Gilead's narrow definition of what a woman should be.
Right. So it could be infertile women, lesbians, political dissidents, anyone who violates their strict moral code.
And they're basically sent to these colonies to work in these hazardous conditions.
Which is essentially a death sentence.
Yeah. And it's so chilling.
It is.
Because it's so arbitrary.
Right.
Right? Like you could be deemed an unwoman for any reason.
And there's no due process, no right to appeal.
And it's a really effective way of silencing any dissent.
Right.
Because people are so afraid of being labeled an unwoman.
It creates this climate of fear and paranoia.
So we've talked about, how Gilead controls women.
Yeah.
But let's talk about how they control everyone.
Okay.
And one of the most pervasive ways is through surveillance.
Right.
Right. The eyes are everywhere.
They're always watching, always listening.
And this creates this atmosphere of mistrust.
Yeah.
Right. You can't trust anyone because you never know who might be an eye.
And it leads to self-censorship.
Right.
Right? People are afraid to speak their minds, afraid to even think certain thoughts.
It's really disturbing to think about the psychological toll that kind of surveillance would take.
And it's so effective, right? Because it's not just about physical control.
Right.
It's about controlling people's minds, their thoughts, their beliefs.
And I think that's what makes Gilead so terrifying.
Right.
Right. It's not just a physical dystopia, it's a psychological one.
Exactly.
And I think that's what makes Atwood's story so relevant even today.
Yeah, because it's a warning about the dangers of totalitarianism and the ways in which it can creep into our lives.
And how easily we can become complicit in it.
Exactly.
And it's interesting, right? Because we see how this surveillance kind of plays out in different ways throughout the book.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just the eyes.
Right.
It's also the way that the handmaids are kind of constantly policing each other.
Yeah. They're encouraged to report on each other.
Right.
To turn each other in for any perceived transgression.
And it creates this real sense of paranoia and mistrust.
Right. Because you never know who to trust.
Yeah, and it's so effective, right? Because it prevents them from forming any kind of solidarity.
Exactly. It keeps them isolated and divided.
And it's really a classic tactic of oppression, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Divide and conquer.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the handmaids, the wives, the Marthas, the Econo wives, the unwomen.
Yeah.
But I think it's important also to talk about the commanders.
Right.
Right? Because they are the ones who are really in charge.
They hold all the power.
They're the architects of Gilead.
Yeah.
And they're often portrayed as these kind of cold and calculating figures.
Yeah, they're very much products of the patriarchy.
Right.
They believe in male dominance and female subservience.
And they use religion to justify their actions.
Right. They twist scripture to fit their own agenda.
And they're also very hypocritical.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. They preach about piety and morality.
Yeah.
But behind closed doors, they're engaging in all sorts of
transgressions.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting how Atwood kind of explores the psychology of these men.
Right.
Or like what drives them to create this society?
And I think it's a combination of factors, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's fear, there's a sense of entitlement, there's this belief that they are somehow superior.
And there's also this real sense of anxiety about declining birth rates,
right?
And social unrest.
They're grasping for control in a world that feels like it's slipping away from them.
And they use this crisis to justify their authoritarian regime.
Exactly.
And I think it's a really important reminder that these kinds of regimes don't just emerge out of nowhere.
Right.
They often arise in times of crisis and uncertainty.
When people are afraid and looking for answers.
And they're willing to give up their freedoms
in
exchange for a sense of security.
And that's the danger, right? Because once you give up your freedoms, it's very difficult to get them back.
And I think that's one of the most chilling aspects of Gilead.
Yeah.
Is that it feels so plausible.
It does.
Right? Like it's not some far-fetched science fiction scenario.
It's rooted in our reality.
Yeah, and I think that's why the book continues to resonate
Yeah,
with readers today.
absolutely.
Because it's a warning
Right.
about the dangers of complacency
And the importance of being vigilant.
and of fighting for our rights.
Exactly.
So we've talked a lot about the negative aspects of Gilead.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to also acknowledge
Yeah.
that there is hope in this story.
Right.
Right? There is resistance,
There is.
and it comes in different forms.
Yeah.
So we see it in Offred's, her own personal acts of rebellion.
Right.
You know, her hoarding her secret relationships,
Our memories.
her memories.
Yeah.
All of these things are ways of resisting.
Of holding on to her humanity.
Yeah, and of refusing to be completely controlled.
Exactly.
And then we also see resistance in the form of Mayday,
Right.
this underground network of rebels.
Who are working to overthrow Gilead.
And we don't know a lot about Mayday.
Right. It's very secretive.
But its very existence gives us hope,
Yeah.
right? It shows that even in the darkest of times,
Yeah.
there are people who are willing to fight for what's right.
And I think that's a really powerful message.
It is.
Right? That even when things seem hopeless,
Yeah.
there's always hope.
And that we should never give up.
Absolutely.
So I think one of the key takeaways from The Handmaid's Tale
Yeah.
is that we have to be vigilant.
Right.
We have to be aware of the dangers of totalitarianism.
And the ways in which it can creep into our lives.
And we have to be willing to speak out against injustice.
And to fight for our rights.
And for the rights of others.
Absolutely.
Because as Atwood shows us, you know, it's so easy to lose our freedoms
Yeah.
if we're not careful.
And once they're gone,
Yeah.
they're very difficult to get back.
So I think, you know, The Handmaid's Tale is a really important book
Yeah.
to read and to discuss.
Especially in today's world.
Yeah, because it's more relevant than ever.
Absolutely.
And I think it's a book that really kind of stays with you
Oh, absolutely.
and makes you think about the world in a different way.
And I think that's the power of dystopian fiction, right? It holds up this mirror
Yeah.
to our own society and asks us to really examine, you know, what we're doing,
What we value.
what we value,
Yeah. And where we're headed.
and to really think about, you know, what kind of future we want to create.
And I think one of the things that Atwood does so well in this book
Yeah.
is she doesn't give us easy answers,
Right.
right? It's not a clear-cut good versus evil kind of story.
It's very nuanced.
Yeah, the characters are complex.
Right.
The situations are messy.
And it forces us to really confront some uncomfortable truths.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it so thought-provoking,
Right.
right? Because it's not just entertainment. It's really making us think.
It's a challenge.
Yeah.
It's a call to action.
And I think that's why it's so important to read this book
Yeah,
and to discuss it and to really kind of grapple with its themes.
absolutely.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into The Handmaid's Tale, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what you think is the most important message.
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's really about the importance of vigilance.
Yeah.
Right. Like we've been talking about, Gilead doesn't happen overnight.
Right.
It's this gradual erosion of rights.
Yeah, it's the little compromises that
Exactly.
we make along the way.
And it's so easy to get caught up in our own lives.
Right.
And to not pay attention to what's happening around us.
And to think that it can't happen here.
Right.
But Atwood shows us
Yeah.
that it can.
It can happen anywhere.
Yeah. So I think, you know, the most important message is to be aware,
Yeah.
to be vigilant, to speak out against injustice.
And to never take our freedoms for granted.
Absolutely. And to recognize that, you know, freedom is something that has to be constantly fought for
Right.
and protected.
It's not a given.
Yeah. And I think that's a message that's really relevant today,
Oh, absolutely.
you know, more than ever.
Yeah. I think we're seeing, you know, a lot of these themes playing out in the real world.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder that we can't be complacent.
We can't be silent.
Right.
We have to speak up.
We have to resist.
And we have to fight for the kind of world that we want to live in.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today
It was my pleasure.
and for sharing your insights on this really important and powerful book.
It's a book that I think everyone should read.
I agree, and I hope that our listeners will pick it up and give it a read if they haven't already.
And if you have, you know, reread it.
Yeah.
Because there's always something new to discover.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, and to all of our listeners out there,
Yeah.
thank you for tuning in.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.